ears, you have a captive audience with the door closed, so you have to tell me how many minutes I have. I like to keep myself. DPS Ruby Park, Mr. Kohli, Madam Principal, and teachers. I hope I've got the order correct. It is indeed a great honor to be amidst you today. Though I have to confess, asking a professor of neurosurgery to talk about nuances in education and career counseling is a bit like asking your hairdresser to talk about your brain. The problem is not only a depth of perception, but also a perception of depth. However, I have been fortunate to be a teacher in that I have just completed 20 years as a professor, and therefore feel perhaps slightly qualified to talk to you amongst the midst of famous educationists in this room. I think education is a subject in which this country has made enormous strides in the 3/4 of a century that we have existed on this planet. We've had the 86th Amendment, which introduced Article 21A, which changed elementary school education from the directive principles to a fundamental right. We've had Article 45, which made childhood care and education below the age of 6 to be compulsory. And we've had the Right to Free and Compulsory Education Act of 2009, which started the Sarva Shiksha Abhijan in this country. And that brings me to my first note of unhappiness. Free and compulsory education. Nothing that is free is compulsory, like fresh air in Calcutta, for example. And we know that you never appreciate the worth of what is free because you think its value is nothing. Because we often equate price with values. So the patient that gets medicine free from a doctor who gives his service free never feels quite as cured as if he spent the same money for the same medicine. The sad state of affairs of our education, however, extends a little more than that. The UNESCO State of Education report in 2021, published in the height of the pandemic, showed that 11.6 lakhs teaching positions are vacant in schools in this country. The study by the National Institute of Education Planning and Administration, called NIEPA, actually showed that teachers in our schools spend 19% of their time teaching and spend the rest of the time on administrative trivial affairs. So the problem in this country has not only been a problem of teacher-student ratio. You know, I always say teachers are like those candles that burn themselves out from the podium so that light can be transmitted to the younger members in the room. But if you have, by the law of energy, your light to be transmitted to 20 individuals, each one shines a little bit brighter than if you have that light having to be shared by 40 or 60. And that's why the teacher-student ratio makes a huge difference. But really, if you ask me, what is one problem that plagues our education system? My answer would be the lack of holistic development. At the risk of never being invited to this school again, I will say the problem with teachers is that you teach your students how to answer. You do not teach them how to question. The problem is that our schools teach us how to secure marks, They don't teach us how to build character. After all, building character doesn't get you into IITs. So, unfortunately, there is a big difference between what our schools do. And I always say, to obtain high marks, get good ranks, get into universities, the sort that are represented on your IC3 system, you need to get good marks. To get good marks, you need to be taught to answer questions. To build character, you need to be taught to question answers. In fact, you need to be taught to question the questions themselves. And that is, I think, when you reach the pinnacle of education. I love the old Chinese proverb which states, teachers open the door, but you must step inside the room yourself. Our education system relies on the teacher opening the door, holding your hand and dragging you into the room whether you like it or not. And yet, you remember what Mahatma Gandhi wrote. He wrote, live as if you were to die tomorrow. Learn as if you were to live forever. The biggest problem with all of us that teach is that we substitute logic with learning. And I learned this from none other than my son when he was 3.5 years old. And we took him on our first trip to the United Kingdom. My wife was also a doctor and a professor of pathology, was already there. So my son at 3.5 suffered his first major psychological trauma. He had a single parent for 7 days, and then had a single parent accompanying him on a flight all the way to London, and then another flight to Manchester where we were going. We went to the house of this friend of ours, who we had known. We had lived in that city for some time during our training period in life. And my son and I walked into their house, and the couple said, we'll take your wife out, we're going out, but you guys, it's 11 o'clock your time, so two of you have dinner, we'll lay the dinner for you, you have your dinner, we'll just take your wife, we go out, do some shopping, come back, and then we'll have dinner later. So my son and I had dinner, and after dinner, I told my son, okay, now take your plate, we've got to go and wash it. And at the age of almost 4, for the first time in his life, he saw his father wash a dinner plate after dinner. He was made to do the same, though he continuously questioned why he had to wash his plate. And I said, this is England, you have to wash your own plates. We went to sleep that night, and as 4 years old do, he woke up on Indian Standard Time in his biological clock at 4 a.m. on a Sunday morning in England, woke the rest of the household up by 5 a.m., much to the embarrassment of his parents. And then, a friend of mine who was our host for that night said, look, I'll take him out and show him my car and show him my garden and keep him entertained. I took my son out, and he had this super duper Mercedes with a soft top parked on his driveway. He took my son into the car, and he said, I'll show your son the car. And of course, when you'd have a 4-year-old with a stranger, as parents, you know what you do the same as you do with teachers. You peer out of your first floor window wondering what's going on there. And he took my son into the Mercedes and showed him the car. God knows what they did. They had a conversation for 20 minutes. And then my friend got out of one door of the car, my son got out of the other door. He looked up on the first floor, saw me at the window, and said, tell your father if he's any good as a neurosurgeon, he should have a car like this for you to drive. His father at that time, by the way, drove a Maruti 1000. And my son looked at the car, looked at me, looked at him, and without batting an eyelid said, instead of spending so much money on your car, why don't you employ somebody to wash your dinner dishes after dinner? And two of us could have dug a hole on that ground and sunk ourselves in to the ground in England. But it also gave me an insight into how simple a child's brain is and how simply it works. And having touched a few thousands children's brains, and I've been privileged to touch them every day of my operating life, I can tell you, it is an amazing organ. It is an organ that we as adults fail to recognize is far more evolved than what we possess. And I think the biggest failure of us as teachers is that we do not appreciate the Darwinian philosophy that our next generation is born much more evolved than we were. So we need to get ourselves to the pedestal that they are on and not speak down to them from the pedestal on which we are perched, like I am right now. The other big problem that plagues our education system, as a doctor, I have to tell you, is the high academic pressure. In the year 2019, 12,000 students committed suicide in this country because of the pressure of education. And again, I think we're at fault. Those of us that belong to my vintage and went to school when dinosaurs were still there on this planet will recall we had a board game in school called Ludo. Remember? We had to play dice, you had colors, and the aim was to reach that top left-hand corner, which was the winning square. And we all fought over who would reach there first. Unfortunately, as teachers and parents, we still teach our students this. That's the winning square. Everybody has to get there first. You have to be the first boy in the class. You have to be the first in the joint entrance exam. You have to be the first in the IIT entrance exam. You have to be the first everywhere. There's only one room at the top though. But what I always say is, if you turn that board round, on the other side of the Ludo board, again for people of my vintage, you will remember there was a game called Snakes and Ladders. And I think there is no better game for a child to play than Snakes and Ladders. Because whoever designed that game, designed it so that the children would know there are ladders with which you can climb up rapidly in life, but there are snakes which will also pull you down. And life is much more about snakes and ladders than about you. In fact, that's the problem of our system. A friend of mine, a classmate of mine, who was a topper in English from Presidency University, it was Presidency College then, and then went on to become a topper from St. Stephen's, went on to Oxford University to do a PhD on Shakespearean tragedies. And he always says, the first day he had a class addressed by the professor and head of English, he was asked a very interesting question. He wasn't asked about any Shakespearean tragedy characters as he'd been asked in Presidency and in St. Stephen's. He was asked, choose one of the Shakespearean tragedy characters, Naim, his name was Naim, and tell me, if you were Shakespeare, how you would have treated and wrote about this character differently from what William Shakespeare has written in that play. And he said to me, it was far easier for me in India to recollect the narrow streams of knowledge. I could tell him about every single tragedy of Shakespeare. I could narrate every character from the Shakespearean tragedies. I could analyze their character. But here, I was not asked to recall from the narrow streams of knowledge. I was asked to paint on the broad canvas of human imagination. And that was so much more difficult. Because that is what we do not teach our students. I always say it's the clown analogy. You remember when you were small, or even if you were in junior school, you had these clown pictures. So you had a clown with a green hat, a yellow face, a pink shirt, and an orange tie with a green or a brown trouser. And then you had another clown next to it, drawn in black and white, and your teacher said, please color this clown. So you had to look at the colors that were there, and you had to color them with the same colors. And God help you if you did that cap in pink instead of red. We should not ask our students to paint clown pictures with colors. We should give them a piece of white paper and the colors and ask them to paint. That's where we failed. We haven't done that. We've made them paint the clown. We have been the clowns in this entire episode because we haven't handed them that canvas where their imagination can go wild and their fantastically evolved brain can give them an idea of what they can achieve with 4 color pencils and a blank piece of paper. That is where we failed in our education system. Just to tell you a little bit about counseling, because I don't want to overstay my time here, and I always stop speaking when I see people looking at their watches. Thankfully, not a lot of people wear them these days. I have been a victim of failure of any form of career counseling. When I finished school, I thought I was going to be a doctor. God knows why. Maybe because my father was a doctor. But I decided, let's give all the exams. So I did. And believe it or not, I got into IIT. So I thought, wow, I got into IIT. These are supposed to be fantastic institutes. I went and joined in IIT, not very far away from here. And that's where I'm guilty of my first criminal offense in life. 3.5 months into IIT, the joint entrance results of medicine came out. And I thought, wow, I've got in. So I left that seat, wasted a seat, and got into medical college. I had no idea in medical college what specialty I was going to pursue. I hadn't a clue what neurosurgery entailed. Believe it or not, when I was a medical student, neurosurgery in Calcutta was as primitive as the dinosaurs I referred to. So I had no opportunity to see what neurosurgery was. And then one day, I still remember, a tram conductor had an accident on College Street, which is where my medical college was located, was admitted under my general surgical team. And he had what I now know today, a brain condition that could have been treated by a first-year trainee resident of mine, and I run a postdoctoral training program in our hospital in neurosurgery. And our first-year resident could have sorted it out with an operation which took 20 minutes. Nobody, including the professor of neurosurgery in medical college at that time, was willing to do the surgery. And we watched over 5 days the agonizing story of a 28-year-old tram conductor die with a completely treatable condition. And I just suddenly thought, I have to do neurosurgery. This is ridiculous. And that's why I did neurosurgery, having no idea what it entailed. If today I was going to do career counseling, to somebody wanting to opt for medicine, this is what I would tell him. Do you know what it involves? It involves, when you're in class 11, 12, sacrificing all your English and other classes and attending various tutorials that teach you how to get into medical school. And you may not. So you get a bad rank in CBSE or IIC or whatever you're doing in class 12, and you try another year and you might get in that year into medical school. Your relation will last all of 5 years because you would have spent 5 years in medical school. Then you have 1 year to be an intern, where you will get a pittance as a salary for working essentially like a slave does in a hospital environment, like the slaves did in the past. And at the end of that, you will have to appear in a postgraduate entrance exam. If you're in this city, in this state, 20% of seats are open for you if you have a surname like mine. 20% seats for post-graduation are for open candidates in this state. So you can guess how many attempts you have to make to get into post-graduation. And when you get out of post-graduation, all your other friends and classmates at that time are moving around the city in chauffeur-driven Mercedes, and you're struggling to see whether you can get a job. You will have to work as a doctor where currently in this state, Medicine is the only profession in the private sector where the government decides how much you will get paid for teaching patients that are sent to you under various government schemes. And since in this state, government schemes are given to people who also travel in chauffeur-driven Mercedes, they will come in chauffeur-driven Mercedes and they will produce a card and you have to operate on them free. Are you prepared for that when you decide you want a career in medicine? Have your school career counselors told you that when they discussed a career in medicine? This is what I asked myself. I think career counseling is all about the 5 letters of the alphabet, A, E, I, O, U. A stands for assessing options. E stands for exploring alternatives. And I hope after this morning you will explore alternatives if any of you want a career in medicine. I is for investigating. Investigate the one choice that is closest to your heart. A-E-I. O is to organize yourself to fit that role. So you have to be a circle to fit into a circle. And finally, you. Utilize your passion and utilize your skill sets. So to my mind, career counseling is all about A-E-I-O-U. Concentrate on what you want to do. So if it's cricket that you're involved with, think cricket. Don't think of MRF tires or TMT steel. To conclude, I would like to tell you that I returned to IIT Kharagpur, which I had departed after 3 months as a student, as a professor many, many years later when they opened their Institute of Medical Science and Technology. I taught there for 4 years. In fact, I couldn't travel to IIT on weekdays, so I used to travel on a Sunday morning and all my classes were all on Sunday and I drove back late at night. But I did that for 4 years. I had people doing their thesis under me. And then I even taught in their campus in Calcutta for 4 years. And then I left. You know why? Because when I looked at the students that we had taught for these 4 years, for this very competitive master's degree course, 90% of them were not in India. And when I went to IIT, I told the director, I'm not coming here anymore. Because what is the point of my teaching people to learn their skills to practice in another country? And I still remember, he took me outside his office and he said to me, see this foundation stone? This was laid by our late Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. And outside the director's office is the foundation stone, which says, dedicated to the service of the nation, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, May something, 1950 something. And he said to me, our late Prime Minister wrote this foundation stone. He himself said, dedicated to the service of the nation, so that was written on the foundation stone. Only thing he forgot to mention which nation. And from 1996 to 2015, 50% of our toppers of class 10 and class 12 have left this country. Who's responsible? You and I, who have taught that. So I think, just from a point of inexperience, I would tell you this, that it is time that we taught our students not what to think, but how to think. It is time we stopped teaching our students the laws of electromagnetism, but started teaching them how to change an electric bulb. Don't teach what. Let them learn why. And as I tell my postdoctorate students on the first day when they come to our department, you have to learn not to look, but to see. You have to learn not to hear, but to listen. You have to learn not to touch, but to feel. Because for you, it is not to live, it is to experience. And finally, to teachers, I have only one small submission to make. I always hated it in school when some of us walked into class and our teacher said, here are our tops boys. Here's the first boy of the class, or here's the second boy of the class. Stop thinking of your classes as students that are good, bad, and ugly, best, good, and average. And remember what I always say, that every single student in your class is like a match in a matchbox. Some you have to take out and strike once and they light up. Some you need to strike twice or thrice. But when they light up, each one shines with the same amount of light. Remember that when you enter your class the next time. Thank you very much.